This lecture continues art of the later 20th century following abstract expressionism with pop art of the younger generation who rejects the seemingly snobby and or elitist approach that they see in rejecting all references to the outside world and instead wish to bring back in the recognizable imagery now from the common everyday advertising language of television and popular culture from the 1950s and 60s. Now, the backdrop to pop art and its biting satire and irony is going to be the spread of communism and two wars. At the end of World War II, America and her ally in Russia are closing in on the Nazi stronghold in Berlin, Germany. Russia makes it their first, thus beginning the Cold War, where the globe will be divided into two spheres of influence between the two superpowers of the United States and Russia. We find that in the eastern side of the world, communism and the ideology from Russia spreads to the eastern bloc of countries as well as East Germany and all the way down to China, threatening to spread further into spreading south from Russia and east to China. Communism is going to find a great and unlikely ally in the People's Republic of China, founded in 1949. But it does not stop there. It threatens to spread even further south and east to Korea and Vietnam. So, in an attempt to curb the expansion and contain Soviet and communist ideology in the rest of the world, the United States sent in troops first to the Korean War and then the Vietnam. Now, Korea and Vietnam are going to be on opposite sides of northern and southern China, respectively, with North Korea to this day remaining largely communist in ideology, whereas South Korea remains free and democratic, supported by the United States and her allies. Whereas Vietnam also threatened in the north to convert to communism, and thus sparked the Vietnam. Now, the first war after World War II to thwart the spread of communism was the Korean War, often forgotten in American history. This is where South Korea, the United States, and Great Britain joined forces to go to war and battle the communist North Korean government, along with China and the Soviet Union. Now, this is going to see Russian fighter jets and tanks in these exercises fighting the remnants of the military for America's side in the Pacific. Following that up, we have the Second Indochina War, after the Korean War, as it is known, in Vietnam. Hence, the Vietnam War will pit southern Vietnam, South Korea, again an ally of the United States, Thailand, Australia, New Zealand, and the Philippines, as well as many other democratic Asian states, against North Vietnam, the Viet Cong, Cuba, Bulgaria, Eastern Germany, Korea, China, and the Soviet Union, as well as other Eastern Bloc Soviet countries. A massive military operation under the auspice of... Now, the backdrop to all of this was the rather frightening possibility of nuclear war that we still deal with to this very day. And during the Cold War, from the end of World War II until 1991 and the fall of the Soviet Union, we had, between the two superpowers of the United States and Russia, this understanding that if nuclear war were to occur, there would be mutually assured destruction, otherwise known as MAD. Hence, neither side would actually win in this game, in this scenario, because nuclear weapons would annihilate humankind and lay waste to our cities, and the nuclear residue and fallout would make many areas of the earth uninhabitable for decades. And so we never actually carried out a nuclear attack or assault. The consequences were horrific, but on a daily basis, people were reminded that that was a possibility. Now, turning to what is happening in the art world, modernism, driven by an emphasis on the formal elements, runs its course, eventually completely denying the outside world and representational imagery until we just have flat areas of paint on a canvas. Now, the younger generation sees this as elitist or snobbish because it is inaccessible to the general public. You need a great deal of background information or education to understand and appreciate these paintings before you hear. Instead, this new generation wants to choose sources from popular culture in a new democratic form of art, bringing back recognizable imagery, bringing back imagery from the outside world. Why do we need to focus solely on the formal elements? Why can't things from the outside world still be considered? Now, John's lifelong lover, Robert Rauschenberg, also practices neo-Dada in found art or reusing things that already existed. Now, he's born in Texas and moves to New York in 1947, around the same time as John's. He attends the Black Mountain College of Art and Design and studies under de Kooning, that New York school painter. In 1955 to 1960, Rauschenberg will be known for producing combines, as he calls them, where he literally combines his abstract expressionist art with found objects, such as junk art or things that are cast off as refuse from society. Hence a very neo-Dada. In his combine seen here, which brings together painting, sculpture, and non-traditional materials, such as a soap box that has been glued to the surface of the painting, a pillow, a piece of wood, a photograph of a boy reaching up in water, and newspaper elements. This one from 1959, the term canyon is going to be very unclear and rather less than stating clearly what Rauschenberg is intended. Instead, you must be well versed in art history and in the iconographic conventions of Western art to suss out the interpretation of these very non-traditional elements. So what do we have but a stuffed eagle alighting on this cardboard box that's going to be attached to a piece of wood, dangling from which is a dirty pillow with a flattened steel drum, family photos, clippings from newspapers, magazines, and then fragments of political posters. All of which overloads the viewer, reflecting the same overload that you would feel in popular visual culture, which in the 1950s, people from 1955 with the launch of TV onwards, felt as though they were bombarded in advertisements, in magazines, newspapers, billboards, and then television commercials now, and were saturated with this new popular visual culture, unable to So in this instance, you can see how John's and Rauschenberg's works are both neo-Dada, both taking from elements that are recognizable from the outside world, but combining them in a new, unique way that does not clearly reveal its intent or the content. Now, this is neo-Dada because we are assembling or taking things from mass-produced or otherwise non-traditional arts materials. Like the case of Hannah Hawk, for instance, with her cut with a kitchen knife Dada. We have a photo montage taken from mass-produced imagery. Whereas in Rauschenberg, we have a stuffed bird or a manufactured pillow or these images that otherwise are from popular visual culture. Now, this frustrates a unifying meaning where the viewer must find their own meaning. Now, like Dada, and assembling or putting these very non-traditional things together. Here is Raoul Haussmann's example. This does have a precedent in the history of art, but it is less clear as to what Rauschenberg intends. We actually must know art history and the imagery associated with mythology, specifically that of the rape of Ganymede, where a young boy, a young shepherd traditionally in Greek and Roman myth, is going to be spied by the king of the gods, Zeus or Jupiter, who transforms into an eagle and carries this attractive child to be his cupbearer on Mount Olympus. So we see that in the boy raising his hand, willingly going with the eagle, who is perching here on the pillow, symbolic of buttocks. Now, obviously, Rauschenberg and Johns are gay, and so the fundamentalist Christian family he grew up with would not allow direct, overt homoerotic interpretations, and so the undercurrents here are very subtle as far as homoerotic culture is concerned. It becomes a bit more obvious in his later works, such as Monogram, with the wonderful metaphor of a goat in a tire for anal sex. Now, turning to official pop art, in the late 1950s, there is an explosion of visual culture and mass media. We have disposable income from the post-war young during the baby boom, as we now call it. Those soldiers coming back from war, getting married, settling down, and raising a family. It is at this time we have the explosion of television and advertising. So pop art actually begins in Great Britain and finds its eventual zenith, or its ultimate expression, in the United States in the 1960s. But in the 1950s in Britain, the culture was one of consumerism, in that one's identity was determined by what you purchased. So pop artists will critique this fiction and superficiality of popular perfection, whereby you were what you owned. And so advertising at this time is going to target younger generation with disposable income and will align this notion of consumer identity. So in post-war Britain, the government actually claimed, as you find the presidency of George W. Bush, whereby the recession could be overcome through consumption and consumerism. So they actually told individuals they needed, for the good of their country, to go out and purchase things, to be good consumers, and that would raise post-war Britain out of the slump. Now, obviously, this is going to be rife for cultural critique and satire with Richard Hamilton and other English artists. In Hamilton, we find a painter and collage maker who trains at the Institute of Contemporary Art in London and will become the so-called father of pop art. He is going to argue that modern mass visual culture is replacing traditional art for the public, that being movies, television, and advertising now define beauty instead of classical statuary or beautiful academic painting. In one of his most famous works, Just What Is It That Makes Today's Homes So Different, So Appealing, from 1956, we have a traditional Dada-esque collage, whereby all of the images are taken from popular publications, magazines, and/or newspapers, or comic books of the day. In the collage, we have an easily recognizable set of images, all from popular consumer culture, but in this case used for social satire purposes. The satire, of course, relating even with the name, which is an advertisement itself, trying to point out what is so different about consumer culture, what makes, again, life during the time so appealing and different. In it, we have the latest technologies, from canned hams, which are going to reduce the amount of cooking time required of women in the household, to television, to radio and recording instruments down here, to, once again, vacuum cleaners, showing you that ordinary cleaners reach only this far as a woman is going to be vacuuming upstairs. Whereas outside, we have the theater and modern-day matinee entertainments and cinema. We have mass-produced automobiles with a Ford symbol in the background. We have, again, a portrait of John Ruskin above the television, who claimed that modern art was destroying, once again, culture. Whereas right next to it, you have a dime store magazine of young romance, which is going to be elevating the common to fine art. And finally, above, given this is the age of the space race, you have a giant moon hovering over the couple. The man and woman of the house, obviously satirically mocking what we should be holding ourselves up to as a model. We have the woman in a burlesque fashion wearing a lampshade on her head and then pasties over her breasts, is going to be posing seductively on the couch. Whereas the man of the house is a bodybuilder holding a Tootsie Pop strategically over his genitalia, suggesting, obviously, the act of fellatio is... So the critic Lawrence Alloway is going to name this style after the Tootsie Pop, calling it pop art, where this new Adam and Eve points out the ridiculous satire of what we are expected to hold ourselves up to, that being men should all be bodybuilders and women should be overly sexualized. So you find the dime store novel hanging in the place of high art is going to comment on the fact that we are elevating this popular culture to the status of fine art, mocking it as Hamilton is here, saying that popular culture, music, movies, and advertisements are not fine art, but are becoming recognized as the tastemakers, as the benchmark of culture. So here we have, carrying on that Dada-esque interest in satire, social satire with this photo montage, as opposed to political satire, seen in Hannah Hawk when she's going to be mocking the Weimar Republic. So here we have the visual overload more carefully spelled out for us from the 1950s, moving from the rather unclear series of images brought together by Rauschenberg and Johns. We now clearly have a tongue-in-cheek satirical rendition of what is expected of us and what advertising is actually stating is important. Now, this is the opposite of abstract expressionism, happening at the same time, we might add. And it is diametrically opposed to formalism, in that Pollock, Rothko, and other artists are going to be suggesting that paint and the formal qualities of it are how meaning is communicated, and they are carefully crafting it. Whereas pop artists very often are not responsible for making their imagery. They co-opt it from elsewhere, and it is imagery that everyone recognizes from popular culture. So the message is what is important, not the object that is. Turning to America, pop art finds its zenith, its full development, its mature style in the slicker advertising, mass-produced, and production techniques used in American advertising, where we have a flat commercial feel to the imagery, which is tone we'll find is much more ironic, campy, and cynically detached than that in Great Britain. The first practitioner of this style, very famous, is going to be Roy Lichtenstein, who, born in New York and teaching at Rutgers University, is a professor of art. He develops mature pop art with easily recognizable and accessible imagery, monumentalizing disposable consumer culture and mass media, whereby we find he's going to take panels from war and romance comic books, blow them up to monumental proportion, and taking them out of context, elevate them to the significance of high or thus using his technique adopted from Benjamin Day in pulp comics. He uses Ben Day dots. So this is going to be a technique used by the printing industry to reduce the amount of ink required to suggest color in comic books and in print publications. In his Oh Jeff, I Love You Too, But of 1964, we have a single panel closely framing the face of a blonde woman who is holding a telephone receiver up to her ear and mouth, speaking this disjointed statement, obviously taken out of a very emotionally involved context. Now, the fact that he's using the bin day dot technique means that he's trying to remove himself as the careful creator of this work, that instead he's using a commercial technique, as though a machine made this, taking it out of its commercial context and introducing it into a new context, that being fine. To show you the difference between the bin day dots and pointillism, we find that they do not fuse into different colors. Instead, the bin day dots conserve the amount of ink required by having a uniform consistency and distance between them across the surface of someone's lips, eyes, and skin, for instance. Pointillism, which does have uniform dots of pure hue, will blend at a distance. That is the primary difference between the Now, this also is in opposition to gestural abstraction and what is happening with abstract expressionism at the time. It completely denies the presence of the artist's hand, denying the notion of a carefully crafted object. Now, you find that instead it is glorifying the mechanical reproductive process behind modern-day comic books, behind modern-day advertising schemes. And we must remember that comics at the time were not meant to be collector's items. They were purchased by adults and written for adults, with adult themes. For men, we have the theme of war, and for women, we have romance. And so men and women would buy these comic books, read them, and then discard them. They were temporary entertainment. Now here we have represented the parody of a flat, superficial comic book communication. The superficiality communicated here is that of a media-saturated culture of the 1960s. Thus the parody is pulling out of context what is happening here with this woman during a time of female liberation and a time where women are going to be demanding equal treatment to men. So this is a very common subject selected by Lichtenstein and read in these dime store comic book novels, in which we have newly independent women who can now have access to birth control that are ambivalent about their relationship to domesticity. They can now decide what to do with their lives, when to get married, when to have children. So the 1960s is a very dynamic time where relationships and the struggle between the male-dominated notion of relationships is being challenged. Now, to show you how he takes this disposable medium of comic books and monumentalizes it to make it high art, we show you one of these sections, right? In this one, the drowning girl from Run for Love. You're going to have, again, a woman who is independent, not wanting to ask for help from a man. Thus, she puts herself in danger. So this ambivalence is played out in comic books as it is seen in the 1960s. As she states, "I don't care. I'd rather sink than call Brad for help." But it is taken out of context with a one dramatic moment, right? Not having any context before or after the scene, but blowing it up, monumentalizing it. It now becomes high art in a museum. It is no longer something that will be disposed of, thrown away in a moment. So here we have the development from an early approach to pop art in England, whereby we take photo montages, assemble them together in a predictable fashion to make these ironic parallels for social satirical purposes. Whereas in America, the sleek advertising production is going to be used in order to make a single stylish and sexy comment about popular consumer culture that is ambivalent towards our relationship to it, as is the relationship between men and women during the day. Now, turning to Warhol, we have one of the most famous pop artists, and his name is synonymous with pop art. We have an individual who was trained as a commercial illustrator, working for many magazines in the 1950s and 60s. He is a painter, a printmaker, and filmmaker who begins making art in the 1960s and dubs his studio The Factory, thus informing us that he is going to make, like Lichtenstein, art that is not unique, that is not going to be carefully crafted, but instead made like a machine would produce something. Now, he claimed that past art demanded thought and understanding, that you would go to a museum to understand more about the cultural context. However, as Hamilton had warned, he believes that advertising and celebrity culture demands only our attention, and that attention is fleeting, to say the least. He's going to state that we will quickly become bored with what we are looking at, and things will become uninteresting at a predictably faster pace. And art should therefore be like movie stars, interesting for 15 minutes, for in the future, he stated, we will all have 15 minutes of fame. And of course, it has been noted that Warhol foretells the existence of reality TV, where all of us actually become subjects. In his Marilyn Monroe diptych of 1962, we have another commercial technique that's used in the production of t-shirts or poster design, and that is silkscreen. So here we have a silkscreen design, which is a stencil over the screen with the image of Marilyn Monroe replicated again and again. On the left-hand side, we have it in color and in black and white on the right-hand side of this diptych. Now, the commercial technique here, which is used for massive billboards and simple posters and t-shirts, is appropriate. It uses a stencil, which is where you cut out a simple design, and then through painting, whether spraying over the sheet, or in this case, pressing with a squeegee the liquid through the screen, you can easily repeat a design or lettering, and that's why it is preferred by street artists. Now, adhering the stencil to a screen made of a silk fabric stretched across the frame, today using a synthetic fabric, we call it silk screening. So we can push through this stencil repeatedly, one after another, making the same image repeatable, one after another, thus not unique, just like advertising, the movies, and or the cult of stardom and celebrity. Now here, thanks to the squeegee and multiple screens, we can have a different section for a different color and rotate it. So on one t-shirt or poster, we can have several. So with the squeegee pushing the ink and or the color, the paint through the stencil, we can repeat a Thus, for the publicity photo seen here of Marilyn Monroe, we have the yellow blonde color of her hair, the gold background, the blue eyeshadow, the red lipstick, all separate stencils overlapping one. Now, the publicity photo captures the actress and her most notable features, right? The ruby red lips, the makeup, the mole beauty mark on her left cheek, and then the short curly hair. Now, all of which does not show us the individual Norma Jean Baker, but instead the cult of personality, the star that was Marilyn Monroe, her name. Now, this is one of the most famous individuals in the world, and thanks to commercialization of the cult of personality, the individual Norma Jean Baker is lost to celebrity. Stardom becomes a commodity to be used, to be consumed like commercial products, whereby we are going to understand the lives and the personalities of celebrities to be something to be consumed like dime store, newspaper, gossip magazines. Now, you may not be aware of it today, but 1962 was a very important year for Marilyn Monroe, for she committed suicide that year. And on her suicide, the media is going to inundate every form, from the radio to television, newspapers. Articles are published on a daily basis about the suicide. And as Warhol is going to claim, the repeated inundation of what has happened to Marilyn Monroe desensitizes us through repetition. That if we see something horrible long enough and repeated with great consistency and frequency, we no longer feel the same way. We no longer react as it did. On the same task, he also makes a series of car crashes and suicides, repeating them one after another, just as he had Marilyn Monroe's face, showing us that as we watch it on the nightly news, read about it in a newspaper, and now see it online, revealing and reviewing these video clips over and over and over again, that the most horrific acts in history we can become desensitized to. Now, if we look at the color he uses, and the fact this is a diptych, it should remind us of a religious icon, that she becomes a type of martyr, or a contemporary secular saint, if you will. So the diptych has very religious connotations, that she now has moved on in the cult of personality to the cult of the secular saint of Marilyn Monroe, someone still very worshipped in the cult of personality today. So you find that one of the interpretations, with the left-hand side of the composition being in color, while the right-hand side black and white, is that she fades, right? He lets, again, the coloration and the ink fade off as he makes these repeated impressions with a stencil. Thus, the ghostly apparition of Marilyn Monroe fades. So just as the commercial technique used by Lichtenstein with the Ben-Day dots, we find the same technique is going to be, that being the same commercial type of technique is used here by Warhol with silkscreen painting, showing us an image just like Lichtenstein that would be inundated in our daily lives, that we would see over and over again, and that, like consumer culture, is meant to be consumed and forgotten. Now, Claus Oldenburg is going to represent pop sculpture and is much more light-hearted than his satirical contemporaries, especially in the biting satire of Hamilton or that of Warhol. Now, his ironic critique of consumer sculpture and culture is going to have him monumentalizing everyday common objects, from disposable toothpaste tubes to cigarette butts to shuttlecocks to giant sets of fruit to ice cream to clothespins, all of which are comments on how we use something and dispose of it, but in a very light-hearted and satirical and funny fashion. Here in his Lipstick Ascending on Caterpillar Tracks of 1969, we have a commission by his alma mater, where graduate students from the School of Architecture are going to ask him to make a monument for the Second American Revolution of the 1960s. Specifically, that being a revolution relating to civil rights and the protests of the Vietnam War. So the 1960s is going to find protests demanding racial and gender equality as women demand the right to birth control and to equal rights and pay as men. And then, of course, you find that African Americans also demand the right to vote, to have the same rights and live in the same places and the same education as whites in America. And at the same time, we have the Vietnam War and people protesting that. All of that can be seen here in the tongue-in-cheek monument that Warhol is going to make, or that, more specifically, Oldenburg is going to comment on. Here we have Caterpillar Tracks, and on it a lipstick in place of an intercontinental ballistic missile, which people would see on the nightly news. So we are replacing warlike aggression and the fear of mutually assured destruction through a nuclear holocaust with the sexual revolution and the reminder of what is happening at the same time to combat this hate. And that is the lipstick. Originally, the lipstick would have inflated at the tip, making it very sexually suggestive. And so it was the dean of the school demanded that he replace it in 1974. But the eroticism of the lipstick is still very clear, reminding passersby of the slogan of the free love movement being "Make love, not war." So do not engage in the aggressive activities and the colonialist expansion of Vietnam, and instead embrace equality. We find that pop art during this time will challenge the notion that fine art needs to be carefully created and individually created by an artist. That instead we can take commercial and popular imagery and the techniques used to make that popular imagery and elevate it to the level of fine art, removing it from its original context, in the original context, as a commentary on the vapidity of a common and shared cultural critique that we've been looking at since Impressionism. This notion that modern consumer culture in modernity is going to be shallow and leads to inconclusive understanding of our relationships with other individuals and our own. This lecture introduces the styles that followed abstract expressionism and pop art, that being conceptual art and minimalism. These new styles will focus not on the carefully crafted art object, as seen with artists like Jackson Pollock and Abstract Expressionism, nor will they focus on the popularization of pop culture, but instead the dematerialization of the art world itself as a reaction to the political movements of the day. For it was the civil rights movement in the 1960s that will be the inspiration in these social upheavals that will prompt the making of non-commodifiable art and the dematerialization of the art object. Now, this was primarily a reaction against the art market as we know it, that being prompting the rich and mostly white male artists to control what is art, that they are the geniuses that are able to solely create art. Instead, we have a charge to reject that thinking, to reject the notion that art should be commodifiable, and instead that it is the idea. Such was the idea behind the first movement we will look at, minimalism, and the two artists that represent it. The first being Donald Judd. Born in Missouri, he received a BA in philosophy and an MA in art history. Now, he was a minimalist, but he despised the term. Instead, he wanted to, in his articles, clarifying what his work was about, focus on the autonomy and clarity of the objects in the space that they created around them. Now, the style of minimalism developed largely in New York in the late 1960s, just as pop art had reached its maturity. Now, the dematerialized art object that minimalism sought is otherwise known as ABC art or primary structures, because it rejected the carefully handcrafted objects that art had been considered academically since antiquity. Instead, minimalist sculptors would focus on industrial designs using industrial materials. Here we have a standard Donald Judd design in his Untitled of 1967. In 12 individual units, he asks us to comprehend the art object without a focal point. That being, we do not have one place to look at or one specific unit that captures our attention, and certainly we are divested of interest largely in the object. The shapes are without a specific hierarchy. Therefore, the 12 identical units of iron are going to be autonomous, one after another, in these stair-stepping that we have here arranged on a wall. They are going to avoid the allusion to any particular subject. Therefore, they are not made to look like a man or a figure from the Bible or from antiquity, nor do they look like something in popular culture. They are what they are. They are aggressively themselves, and this is very important for understanding minimalism. Now, this is abstraction without reference. So we have many minimalist sculptors that focus on the industrial materials themselves, not attempting to make you think of something outside of what is being represented. Therefore, the most interesting thing about minimalism is the materials it is made of. Not asking you to think of the divine like abstract expressionism, not trying to communicate something emotional. It is what it is. Now, the best way to understand it as well is a complete denial of representational subjects, but unlike abstract expressionism, minimalism will focus on the material, right, denying form. So this is dematerialization. We are not saying that it looks like or represents anything other than what it is. Now, the problem with minimalism is that it suffers from objecthood. That being, the significance of it is in the fact that it is an object, which means that it is no more interesting than any other non-art object, such as a cinder block, a brick, or any other industrial material that you can find laying around. Therefore, it quickly becomes boring and loses its momentum. Now, the approach to art making that is going to happen at the same time as minimalism, and for that matter, abstract expressionism, is going to today be known as performance art, but in the 1950s and 60s is going to be known as happenings. So this approach to the artistic process is going to state that the process of making art is as important as the carefully crafted finished object itself. Now, this was opened up for understanding and appreciation by Pollock, whose action painting had made the action of making it as significant as the final product. That's why Time magazine is going to have an entire retrospective and is going to take several photographs of Pollock making his works. Now, the physical enactment of art is going to be transformed into a work of art in its own right. Therefore, Pollock dancing around his canvases would become the art, not the final product of the canvas on his floor. Enter the Gutai, the embodiment group that's founded in 1954 in Japan, that, as they state, was meant to pursue the possibilities of pure and creative activity with great energy. Now, we find that this group, following the humiliating defeat of Japan in World War II and the dropping of 2 atomic bombs on them, is going to reveal the immateriality and the impermanence that is left on the Japanese people, and their feeling that everything is in flux and changing. So we find them dealing with that in a new type of happening or performance art. Here we have Shozo Shimamoto in his Hurling Colors of 1956, one of the most famous practitioners of Gutai, in which he's going to shatter bottles of paint and have it fling across canvases. So the smashed bottles are going to make these very elaborate spatter patterns across these various canvases. But he takes it further than Pollock. He's going to state that the art is solely in the performative act itself, not in the final product. Therefore, they destroy the works of art at the end of each performance. And we encourage you to watch the movie illustrating Shimamoto's approach here as he smashes bottles of paint in celebration of his original project in 1956. The next very famous performance artist, who is the founder and leader of New Realism in 1960, is that of Yves Klein. Yves Klein is a French artist in post-war Paris, where, as in the Japanese example we just looked at, is struggling for a new approach and identity in art after modern art moves to America. So they are reacting to the New York School and Jackson Pollock. So you find that Klein is going to argue that painting ends with Pollock in the New York School, that art must now take from the real world, much like pop art looked to popular culture. In his performances, such as Anthropometries of the Blue Period of 1960, he's going to have the act of creating something held up as the performance or the artfulness of a work itself, not the end goal. So here, he's going to have 3 models covered in blue paint, pressing their bodies against sheets of paper, accompanied by a 20-piece orchestra playing a single note. All, once again, painting in blue. Now, the final products that are made are largely illegible abstract designs because the art making is a gestural act like gestural expressionism. But the final work is the imprint of the actual model slash artist. The person who is making it in this way presses their body against the surface. Now this was, according to Klein, a commentary on the pretentiousness of Pollock's action paintings. And I invite you, of course, afterwards or now to watch the video that's going to be located right after this link in your LMS account. It shows, again, the single note and women being directed by Klein to move about and press their bodies against the surface of these walls and floors. Now, what is brilliant about Klein's example here is that for all of academic art history, the female nude body was considered art itself, or the embodiment of the idea of art. When you say art in the Western world, people are going to think of an allegory of the female nude. So in this way, we're also ridiculing formalism by pointing out the ridiculous nature of having women themselves as the subject and as the object painting. Now, turning to Carolee Schneemann, we're going to have one of these early performance artists who's going to use the female body and the object of the male gaze to show and to control how women are seen. So she is a radical feminist performance artist who still works today. Now, during the free love movement of the 1960s, with Woodstock and these other movements, we have a sexual liberation and rebellion against middle-class values, to where, once again, the nuclear family of the 1950s was a man is going to marry a woman and then have 2 children, move to the suburbs, and live. So this restrictive lifestyle was rebelled against by the children of the baby boomers, those coming back from World War II. They instead are rebelling by offering up this new lifestyle, which is important for understanding in the free love movement, which openly had people engaging in orgies with drug use, commenting on the rejection of their parents' values. It is with this as a backdrop we must, of course, consider that Meat Joy is going to be performed. So please, when you have time, watch at least a segment of this performance where Schneemann is going to direct a series of male and female performers. In it, we find in 1964, this radical feminist performance will have 8 men and women undressing each other in a seductive fashion as they dance and roll around on the floor. And then people bring out a mixture of raw fish, sausages, bloody chickens with wet paint and scraps of paper. Thus, of course, rubbing the raw meat all over each other's bodies is meant to remind one of these free love orgies that you believe you're about to see, but instead of in a scopophilic fashion, making you long for an erotic, sensuous image in front of you, is going to turn it on its head and disgust you. We find that the purpose of the performance is to force the audience to smell, taste, and feel the visceral aspects of the body and its fluids, and how, quite frankly, women are treated as pieces of meat in this way. So we find that the disgust that one would feel by smelling raw chicken and thinking about rubbing it on your body should disgust you also when you objectify women, is what she is purporting here. Now, taking the control away from the male audience, which is generally the assumed viewer for these nude female works, is meant to make that same male audience feel uncomfortable. And by all accounts, Schneemann succeeds in this, just as Edward Manet had succeeded in making his audience feel rather uncomfortable with his Olympia of 1863. In the same fashion, in the semiotic dilemma of meaning, we give you Joseph Kosuth in 1 and 3 Chairs of 1965. In it, we're going to have a photograph of a chair, an actual chair, and then the definition of the word chair. So Kosuth presenting these three things together in a conceptual fashion asks us a simple question. Which is the real chair? Now, semiotics, importantly, is going to be the study of signs or meaning construction. How exactly does meaning actually work? So simply put, semiotics is going to deal with signifiers and signifieds. That being, the signifier is going to be that which is meant to communicate something, such as a spoken word or a written symbol, such as what we're reading here, signifier and signified. The signified is going to be what is meant, what it signals. That being, I say dog and you think of a furry quadruped. Now, this is all unfortunately dependent upon the shifting ground of language, and words change in their meaning constantly. It is going to be given meaning as we agree on it as a society in a given time. So you find that words are abstractions. It holds no meaning. Everything you are listening to now and what I am saying is only meaningful because we agree on a system of sounds called English that, when put in a particular order in a monosyllabic or multisyllabic fashion, are interpreted in a particular way. Right, so we find that until everything I am saying is assembled in a particular order, that does nothing. It means nothing. So if I were to say dog, red, ball, bounce, fetch, that means nothing. Whereas if we put it in an order saying that the red bouncing ball is going to be fetched by the dog, then it makes sense, right? So once again, words inherently are meaningless. So we find that the post-structuralist reading of semiotics is just that. That being that meaning is entirely random and arbitrary. That you find our words are only meaningful because they are different than other words. That being, a dog is not a cat or a bat or a rat, right? That is the only meaning of the word dog, right? So we just agreed that that represents a furry quadruped or canine. So you find that these codes are all going to work together to confer meaning. A man is meaningless without a woman as a counterpoint or binary. So here the question becomes, what is the real chair? The object we're referring to, the way in which we refer to it, such as an image or a definition, the idea of what a chair is. And of course there is no answer, that being all of these are a chair. That being, that is the post-structuralist dilemma with conceptual art, and what makes this so brilliant is of course that the artfulness is in the idea, and the idea challenges you to consider how is meaning communicated and what is meaning. What is more meaningful, the letter or the word God, a picture of a God, and or the idea of God? Now, turning to the civil rights movement of the 1960s, where women and minorities in America were both asking for the same rights as men, we're going to have different feminist waves that come about at the same time and also attempt to dematerialize the art world. Now, the first feminist wave emerged in the 1960s and asked the academic community and the public at large to recognize the accomplishments of women artists of the past and present, to just admit that there were women artists. In the 1970s, we follow this up with the second wave, which is going to be defining gender and systems of oppression. That being, how do people actually get repressed? Why were women overlooked? Finally, the third wave happens in the 1990s when we have postmodern interests of postcolonialism, transgenderism, transnationalism, and ecofeminism, which follows every woman that you see here in these photographs is white. So the first wave of feminists are going to be upper middle class Caucasian women. This is followed by an interest in other ethnicities and other orientations. That being, first we are going to recognize white heterosexual women, but then what about Asian women? What about African American women? What about gay women, etc.? So we look at all of these other interests and then ask about these other communities. Turning to Judy Chicago, we have one of the earliest and most famous feminist artists who was born in Chicago but moves to LA. She will attend the UCLA art school, and she is known for her feminist art, that being the reflection and condition of an artist as a woman. So it all relates to femininity. Perhaps her most famous work is going to be The Dinner Party of 1979. In The Dinner Party, we are reflecting on the role of woman as homemaker, whereas we have a triangular dinner party set up with place settings and then individual women invited. Originally, it was intended as a Last Supper with 13 honored guests, so there were 13 place settings. The 13 number relates to a witch's coven, hence you would have the 12 apostles plus 1, so an inversion of the original good Christian tradition. And this refers to the two ways in which women have been considered throughout all of history, as the good, dutiful wife and homemaker and mother, or vilified as a woman that is outside of the control of man and is going to worship the devil. Now, she eventually expands the dinner party to 39 places in a triangle, which has 48 feet on each side. But they find many more names of important women throughout history. Thus, we have tiles on the floor with an additional 999 names. The materials importantly used to make all of this are non-fine art material and or media. They are going to use quilting, ceramics, decorative arts, all of these media associated with women artists throughout history, and therefore were considered not as important as the fine art of men, that being painting, sculpture, and architecture, as established in the Renaissance. Now, the emphasis here, because of the non-traditional art media and the message where we are not giving sole credit to an individual male artist who's primarily white, but instead there were 400 workers that assisted here in this collaborative, collective effort. So here we have a photograph of all of the workers that helped assemble this. As part of it, each of the place settings has a dish with a vaginal or vulva arrangement, emphasizing the biological difference and uniqueness of women from men. So for instance, Georgia O'Keeffe, who was known for her vaginal motifs and floral arrangements in paintings, is going to have a very obviously vaginal plate here that you are meant to think about sitting down and eating. So here is one of her paintings showing you that traditionally her work was interpreted as looking like a flower representing female genitalia. This, of course, was meant to be off-putting to the male audience and very frightening to them, as you find that throughout most of history, women are desexed and or their genitalia are hidden in paintings and sculptures. Now, in this way, we are taking back the objectification of the female body from a primarily male academic audience. So they would walk up and look at this, and instead of objectifying it or seeking to eroticize it, it would repulse them in this way, controlling how it is seen. Thus, of course, women control their own sexuality and bodies. Now, turning to the civil rights movement of the 1960s, at the same time feminists are demanding equal rights for women, you find that African Americans are demanding equal rights for themselves as well to whites. Thus, of course, we have the desegregation of schools and, of course, the repealing of Jim Crow laws. Within this environment, we have Betty Saar, who's going to be born in Los Angeles and schooled at the University of California in Los Angeles. She is a feminist and radical activist, an African-American artist who would collect these stereotyped images of African Americans that are going to be from folk art and pop culture, and she would assemble them in a new way to show the racism endemic and inherent in popular culture. Here we have her Liberation of Aunt Jemima, which is going to be a popular object that most housewives would own at the time, believe it or not, but is going to be presented in a new way. So in it, we have the derogatory stereotype of the cheerful, servile mammy and or the African-American woman that would serve white women, especially in the South. Famous for films like Gone with the Wind. This is where we get Aunt Jemima as this happy woman who's going to be making food primarily purchased by a white audience. Now here, through appropriation, thus we are looking at taking a material from one source and context and introducing it into another. We have a very different interpretation then. In the very racist rendition of Aunt Jemima with a blackface painting and the bright red lips, right? With her image, of course, from the packaging behind her here. This was actually a notepad holder. Only Betty Saar has replaced the pencil with a rifle. And of course, where the notepad is also going to be replaced with an image of the mammy or Aunt Jemima holding a screaming white baby with a black fist in the center. This fist is meant to remind people of the Black Panthers and the civil rights movement at the time, which would be very disquieting and upsetting to Caucasians and whites at the time. So this is going to critique the servile interpretation of black female stereotypes by liberating her and threatening the white viewer. She no longer serves the white audience, but is now reminding them of the challenge of white hegemony or political power at the time. So here, this is activist art that is designed, like Judy Chicago, to elicit extreme discomfort in the viewer. This is not something they want to see, nor do they want to think about or be reminded of. And the effects echo and reverberate in American culture to this day.
This lecture looks at postmodernism, or the art that follows modernity, specifically the style that favored abstraction, beginning with the movement of realism, the first modern movement, and ending with the death of abstract expressionism, when art seeks out new ways to reincorporate the outside world and move beyond self-referentiality. Thus, with conceptual art and minimalism, we saw that the art world tends to dematerialize, not wanting to commodify art in the same way as it had in the 1950s. Now this is when we find a radical shift happening, not just in art, but in Western culture in general. Now, as we began this class, we defined what art was by the period. That being from prehistory to 1800, art can be understood as a reflection of culture. That being, all works of art, as we now call them, are really material culture, reflecting the beliefs, political or religious, of each given time, whether it be a portrait of a pharaoh or a Roman emperor, or an image of a Last Judgment with Christianity. These all tell us about the belief systems and the power systems and struggles in each civilization. They were not considered independent of culture, though. Now, around the advent of Romanticism in the 19th century, we have this idea that art is the expression of this new individual, an artist, this unique and rather inward-looking individual who could feel things more deeply and express them more carefully and clearly than the rest of us could. Thus, we find that art is the expression of an artist during this period, and certainly we would state that the gestural abstract paintings of Jackson Pollock reflect his understanding and interpretation of the collective unconscious in psychotomatism, not someone else's, for instance. In 1970, we have a definitive break in what art actually is and what it represents. Instead of being the sole realm of an artist and creator, art is now going to become the reflection of the artist as culture. In other words, art is going to reflect culture in general, or hold up as a mirror the assumptions that we take for granted in culture, and thus show the injustice that is done to certain groups and or the hypocrisy in certain times. Now, this coincides with the post-industrial age or society in the 1970s, when, in the Western world, we shift from producing goods to the provision of services. In other words, ideas become currency, and through globalization and the information age, most Americans are no longer going to be employed in factories creating things, but instead are going to be in industries that are going to relate to service, whether that being business, education, or once again corporations. Now, it's at this time we find that the modernist international style is going to be the plainly visible structure from abstract expressionism that completely rejects historicism. This is where we left off with modern architecture. This came to stand for corporate power and identity. The standardization and impersonality were like modern corporations. There is nothing unique or individualistic or historical here. It is not relating to or making you think of a Gothic cathedral or another structure. It is just made up of, in a formalist sense, the modern building blocks, right, for architecture: steel, reinforced concrete, and glass. Now, the first media to rise in postmodernism is actually architecture, which is why we bring up what is standard in modernist architecture at the time. Now, postmodern architecture is going to bring back in all of these excluded references to the outside world. And in the book Learning from Las Vegas, it's going to argue that the symbolic aspects of plain and vulgar American culture should be reconsidered and brought back into fine art or high art in architecture. And the best place to understand that is going to be Las Vegas, which is certainly considered to be kitsch, and the architecture is going to be eye-catching and grabbing, but not serious and certainly not considered art. This is where we find Robert Venturi, who's going to state in his books on postmodern architecture that architects should pay attention to ordinary buildings in the vernacular, such as gas stations, fast food restaurants, things that are commonplace and everyday, that would not be considered traditionally designed as we would understand these other modern architects like Le Corbusier, for instance. So he begins to collapse the distinction between fine art and the vernacular, which is central to understanding postmodernism, is that the separation is no longer there. And certainly the traditional media and definition of painting, sculpture, and architecture is going to be challenged. So what we have here is modern architecture will deny the past, will deny any references to prior styles. Postmodern architecture, on the other hand, is going to quote directly from them, bringing them back in a historicist fashion, meaning it's looking to the... Now, leaving off with the Seagram building here by Van der Rohe and Philip Johnson. Van der Rohe famously gave us the axiom that less is more. This is still an oft-repeated axiom in design schools today. Do not overdo it. You don't need a lot of extra decorative flourishes. Instead, Venturi would state that less is a bore, and this becomes the mantra for and the manifesto of postmodernism. Why are we cutting out everything from the outside world? Why does art need to be solely self-referential? Why can't it be humorous and or refer to other things? Carrying on this interest in historicist elements and looking outside of modern architecture, we have Philip Johnson designing the AT&T headquarters in New York in 1984. Here, we have the same pluralistic expressive principles that are being used that remind us not solely of a building, but things outside of it. And in a very clever and catchy way, the work of AT&T and what the corporation is responsible for. Here we have 36 oversized stories, that being not the standard division of stories like in the Seagram building. So that is also different, as is the size and scale seen in the windows in the exterior.
You find that the symmetry is now missing, as we have a large group of windows in the center and this broken pediment again, and then 4 smaller sections off to either side, again asymmetrically arranged. So this is going to imitate the international style in that it has an uncluttered skin, but the asymmetry is here, and it does reference things outside of architecture, which is going to define pluralism at the time. Now, the eclectic mix of historical references can be seen with the broken pediment, as we looked at with the Bonaventuri house, but it also references the vernacular, that being things from the everyday, outside of the world of this is going to actually conflate the shape of a skyscraper with that of a dresser and a payphone. And this is known as pastiche. We are bringing different elements that are incongruous together to form a new function, to serve a new function, and that is as a building, as the headquarters for AT. So this is going to be a pun on the term highboy and high-rise, as it looks like a Chippendale highboy dresser, such as you would have a high-rise or skyscraper associated with it. In addition, we find that the broken pediment at the top and the slots of a highboy dresser look like the coin slots in a phone, and once again a pay phone that you would see around the country at the time, for which AT&T was responsible. That was, once again, their communication empire. So bringing these two together with a pastiche, we have a variety of a hodgepodge from very dissimilar backgrounds and traditions. We are going to bring them together, not from the fine art world, but from the vernacular, from the everyday, and from, again, clever puns and comedic turns of phrases. This is what is appreciated in postmodern architecture and postmodern. Now, turning to how the strategy of creation, which of course postmodernism is not a style, but it is a strategy for art making, how it can be applied to other media. And this is going to require differentiating modernism from postmodernism more clearly. So modernism, as it develops and is carried out in the styles we discussed from realism, impressionism, post-impressionism, expressionism, futurism, and so forth, is going to set forth the belief that art is absolute, that it is ideal, pure, and perfect, that an artist is a single-minded, serious individual who is set apart from society, making these very important works. Right? Obviously, postmodernism then is going to see this as rather arrogant, that being these individuals are claiming that they are incredibly special and that they are making unique objects that are carefully crafted and honed. So postmodernism instead will be a strategy that disregards this idea, that it does not believe in a singular style such as formalism or abstraction or cubism, for instance, but instead will reject the seriousness of modernism and mock the rules of it. So the style itself largely exists to poke fun of, lampoon, or mock what came before. And this is also going to question the very idea of originality. Therefore, you find that postmodern work of today does not need to be original, to where we will even eventually have photographs of other people's photographs, that you will have artists that are referencing clearly and taking from earlier examples, right? So the notion that art need to be original is now passé. Now, this is going to come out of the crisis of cultural authority, that being who is in charge. This questions the homogeneity of modernism and the patriarchy of it, because you will note that most of the artists we have been discussing in the art world, because of how it is structured, are white heterosexual males from the European and American tradition. So where is everyone else? Where do we have these alternative perspectives of women, of different cultures, of those around the world? So postmodernism instead reflects pluralism, that being the social and cultural diversity of the world, of a globalized society, looking not just to Europe and America, but to the entire world. And it's going to believe that the only real constant in this world is change, and that the only thing that we have in common is difference. So we are all different, and who has the right to speak? Who has cultural authority? And in postmodernism, the answer is everyone does, that in a pluralistic society, every group is going to be significant, every religion is as important as the other, and all should have the right to. Now, out of this obviously comes feminism that we discussed last time with conceptual art. So the feminist waves, as we were discussing them, begin in the 1960s, in which we begin admitting that there were significant women of the past. The 1970s, we looked at artists like Judy Chicago, who begin to define systems of gender oppression and how women are actually discriminated against. In the 1990s, we are going to expand that to this postmodern understanding of many different perspectives, of different ethnicities, of different religions, of different identities. So we find that these waves are often seen in art a decade after incubation, after they have had time to process and move through this. Now, enter the Guerrilla Girls, a group founded by radical feminists in New York in the 1980s, who consider themselves the conscience of the art world. Now, they call themselves girls in a derogatory fashion because it is a demeaning term. Thus, of course, instead of women, for instance. And what they will do is compile statistics on the discrimination against women in the art world, and will put it up very publicly, disrupt, for instance, art openings, and once again pay for billboards. In their Advantages of Being a Woman Artist of 1988, we have one of those public service announcements, which is lampooning other public service announcements that you would find on television and in posters. And here we have a series of bitingly sarcastic and sardonic messages about why it is better to be a woman, such as not having to be in shows with men, or working without the pressure of success, or not being stuck in a tenured teaching position. All of the things sarcastically pointed out that women are not afforded, but men have in the 1980s. Notably, we find that the Guerrilla Girls include a website here, and in the 1980s, the only individuals with access to the internet or a website would be those in universities and research institutions. So this is really directed at those policymakers and those institutions where academia defines what art is and who is an artist. So this is going to still enact the first wave of feminism, where we're pointing out discrimination, but not necessarily how it works, not necessarily showcasing or showing us the mechanisms of discrimination against women. They carry this on to this day and still are going to purchase billboards and put up these messages that point out the hypocrisy in the art world, from, again, the painting, sculpture, architecture to that of cinema. Now, the next generation of feminist social activists are going to carry on and move beyond merely pointing out that discrimination occurs and shows how it actually happens. And one of these artists is going to be Barbara Kruger, who was an art director and designer under Condé Nast for Mademoiselle and House and Garden, a very important designer mid-century. So she is a social activist who will convert the language of advertising with these dramatic photos combined with strong declarative slogans, using the language of art, but communicating it in a way we're all familiar with, being bombarded by advertisements on a daily basis, from billboards to newspapers, magazines, and television. Here, her style is going to be easily identifiable using the standard black, white, and red. These are cheap advertising colors used the world over in magazines and newspapers. And all of her messages are going to be anti-consumerism and/or sexism. In, once again, your historicist revival, the second wave of feminism questions gender construction and especially how the male gaze functions. So you find that she will have massive poster installations where she will blow up these huge posters using the language of advertising. Now, what is interesting is the materials and media that postmodern artists select, because they are not traditional painting, sculpture, or architecture. Photography, as we have noted, was never fully integrated into the canon of fine art. And so it becomes the ideal postmodern medium because it is not unique and personal. It is impersonal. It is going to be easily reproduced. So it is not unique. We can print as many versions of a photograph that we want, for instance. So postmodernism is going to reject, as with photography, this notion of originality, of artistic mastery, since artistic mastery and originality are both central tenets of modernist patriarchal art. Now here in her Untitled, or Your Gaze Hits the Side of My Face of 1981, we have one of her examples using the cheap advertising color scheme of black, white, and red. In it, we have the photograph of a classically beautiful female bust seen from the side, with the separate words running down the left-hand side in a vertical sense, "Your gaze hits the side of my face." Now we find that the artfulness here is not in the fact that she is going to cut out these words and put them on this poster and blow it up and print it very large, 55 by 41 inches. The artfulness instead is in the concept, the idea behind this, because anyone technically can be told how to put this together relatively quickly and easily. But the idea is very significant. Just like with conceptual art, we're carrying on in postmodernism this rejection of the commodification of an original, carefully crafted art. Now what we have here is a classical beauty that reveals the process of objectification. That being, we are going to show how the male gaze works. That being, as women walk by, we literally see what men are doing to their bodies, as you would with a classical statue such as the Venus de Milo. Look up and down the form, look up and down and gauge the female body, scrutinizing it, right, as the male gaze is going to objectify her. So this is going to literally be shown in Kruger's example as you are forced to look up and down the side of her face, showing you how men look up and down, sizing women's bodies, objectifying them as they pass. So in this, we are retaining or taking back the control of how people are actually going to be seen. Just as Monet's Olympia looks starkly and sternly out at the viewer, making them uncomfortable, so too does this show you what men are doing to women, thus revealing the process of objectification. Now, this is going to be moving from Chicago's recognition of women, right, that were significant throughout history in her 1979 dinner party, to defining these systems of repression for women, specifically still primarily white heterosexual. Now, turning to race relations and the questions of ethnicity, we look at the photographic work of Lorna Simpson. So Lorna Simpson received her BFA from the School of Visual Arts in New York and her MFA at the University of California, San Diego. She, as a photographer, will deal with issues of race, gender, and sex, and specifically from an African-American woman's perspective, which is different from that of Kruger, that being a in her Stereo Styles of 1988, we still are using the medium of photography, which is, by its very definition, not original, masculinist, or patriarchal, but instead is going to be easily reproduced. Thus, of course, we have a transparency of what we're looking at instead of the hand of the artist being very obvious. In the series of photographs which show her from the back with different hairstyles, we then have written in cursive these words, adjectives, if you will, in the center, describing different types of hairstyles, from daring, sensible, severe, long and silky, boyish, ageless, silly, magnetic, country fresh, and sweet. Now, what she is attempting to do is show us how, without even seeing someone's face, we can stereotype them based on, obviously, the skin tone and ethnicity of this model, being African American, and then the hairstyle they are wearing. Right? So hair, she's pointing out, is an indicator of race, gender, and class. Thus, of course, we tie different hairstyles, especially in African Americans, to class. Do they belong to the upper class or lower class based on the type of. So this is, again, going to be in line with Betty Saar's The Liberation of Aunt Jemima, and pointing out how people are going to be discriminated against, and how we make snap judgments based on someone's appearance. Right, so we are moving from recognition of something that is racist to defining the systems of stereotyping, just as with feminism. What are the underlying mechanisms at work, forcing you to come to grips with the fact that you know nothing about this woman, yet you obviously can classify her and feel differently based on the. So photography is going to be the medium best suited to neutralize these presentations, because we do not have the intermediary of the artist who would therefore make us interpret this in a different way. There is a freshness, a clarity, and an immediacy to photography that makes this possible. Now, turning to the massive installation of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, which is a 247-foot cut into the ground, carved into the very memory and consciousness of the American psyche. We have Maya Lin designing this, and it's carried out between 1981 and 83. The massive sculpture is going to have reflective marble that is going to have the names of people who died in the Vietnam War imprinted on it. So this is a very untraditional monument, which does have a very clear and positive presence, but does not showcase in a representational fashion the individuals who died in Vietnam. Here we find the names of people who died listed chronologically, the most names being in the tallest part of the war with the most casualties. Thus you have the few who died at the beginning that increase until we reach the upper section here in the center, and then slowly taper off as America pulls out of the region. So we know that it's a very powerful, effective monument here because it reflects the people around it. And so you are meant to go through the names and find people who you may have known or been related to. And it very commonly causes individuals a great deal of emotional turmoil, and they break down looking at this because they can see themselves. They survived. They are part of history. So this polished black granite reflects these visitors. Thus, it shows you this postmodern reflection of culture, that being the viewing and making process we are a part of as viewers. The artist is not the be-all, end-all, is not the one who is responsible for creating meaning in works, but we complete the process as the viewer. It only makes sense if we are there reflecting us. Now we find that veteran services and these individuals petitioned to have an additional sculpture added, which is much more traditional, showing individuals dressed in the attire that they would have worn in the war. And this is right next to the monument, a compromise, if you will, between the postmodern monument and the more traditional one. Now, turning to the culture wars of the late 1980s and 90s, we have a period where we see the rise of AIDS and the digital age, right? Artists are going to go up against public officials in America, demanding freedom of speech and public arts funding. We already mentioned that the National Endowment for the Arts often denied these artists funding if they were going to make something that could be considered offensive or obscene, even though it was highlighting social issues of the day. So we find now the peripheral artists who would be on the outs of, or the outside of the main famous fine artists of the day, are going to put center stage issues of gender, sexual orientation, race, and class, because we find the AIDS epidemic is going to be rampant. Enter the photographer Andres Serrano, a Honduran Afro-Cuban who was raised as a strict Roman Catholic in Brooklyn. So he is going to attend the Brooklyn Museum and Art School, and as a photographer will specialize in social taboos, especially using, and he's famous for, feces, bodily fluids, taking photographs of corpses, of the homeless, Klansmen, suicides, and murder victims. Right, you find that his exhibitions will inspire violent and angry reactions. Here are some examples of his work, highlighting very controversial ideas, but still helping us understand the culture wars of the day, questioning these notions of race relations and homosexuality. In his most famous work, Piss Christ, of 1989, we have a photograph that the artist himself tells us is a crucifix that has been suspended in a vitrine with the artist's own urine and blood. So the bubbles one sees here of the urine is going to spark a great deal of controversy in what he was intending. Now, what he's asking is for us to confront the physicality of death and of the body of Christ, which is often forgotten and overlooked in modern Christianity, he argues. That the physical fluids of course, urine and blood force us to remember that Christ's death is going to be associated with an individual who also had bodily fluids. This is going to spark an attack in 2011 where 3 guards are assaulted in France, and these Catholic demonstrators destroyed the piece, very angered by it. So we find that Serrano was, of course, not surprised at the violent reaction to his work here, but understood that individuals may not have understood the message that he was trying to give us. And that is, it is offensive because it critiques this commercialization of Christ's image in the media that overlooks the central tenet to Catholicism, which was the physical suffering and death of Christ on the cross, and instead overlooking it for more commercialized and friendly imagery, which make us in turn forget the fact that we are mortal and made up of bodily fluids and will suffer and die as well. So this is going to spark controversy as far as Andres Serrano's work here over the public funding of arts projects, and people like Helen Frankenthaler will deny the artists funds because they are seen to be controversial or. Now, in the same way that Serrano wishes to confront the physical death of Christ with his Piss Christ, so too did Damien Hirst in his early works want to challenge the notion that we could ever even conceive of our own death. So he belonged to the young British artist group of the 1980s, and his exhibitions were so offensive, the mayor of New York threatened to close the museum because of the controversy associated with them. And in his early works, he is going to be famous for taking animals and suspending them in vitrines, with the message being the impossibility of imagining your own death, right? So that we confront these animals that are flesh and bone in front of us, but we still are unable to come to grips with the fact that we ourselves are made up of flesh and bone and will one day die. Now, these dead animals as subjects suspended in formaldehyde are his most famous early examples, but even his later works still deal with the idea that we cannot understand or imagine our. In his work, Mother and Child Divided, we see just that. Two animals that have been bisected longitudinally, that are placed in two separate vitrines, thus literally a mother and child, a cow and her calf, are divided from each other and themselves. We are invited as viewers and visitors to the section to walk between the vitrines, to see the animal that is going to present to us a vision that is caught between scientific presentation and the disturbing emotions that come along with viewing the internal structures of this animal that very clearly is flesh and bone, forcing us to confront the actuality of death. Bones, muscles, and organs are presented before us, and we have a type of scientific fascination with it, but also the horror of realizing we are also made up of these materials. We will also one day stop breathing and we will die. Now, the backstory to the specific use of cows, we need to remember that in the 1990s, BSE, otherwise known as mad cow disease, was running rampant in the UK and required the daily slaughter of hundreds of cattle to stop the spread of this ailment. And so, in many of his works, he will present the cow or the calf as a martyr that is being killed, of course, unfairly, because it's not their fault that they are getting this disease, just as the individuals stricken with AIDS are not at fault here and should, of course, be given medical treatment and sympathy, which they are not at the time. So he shows them much as a Catholic saint like Saint Sebastian here, shot up with arrows in one of his exhibitions. Now, the AIDS epidemic, which is going to hit the forefront of the media in the mid-1980s, is going to showcase the human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV, that if left untreated turns into AIDS, which is the acquired immune deficiency syndrome, where the body cannot fight off things like a simple cold, and leads to death, especially afflicting the gay communities in America. Therefore, the lack of government concern and or money being provided for treatment and or research into this epidemic leads to activism. Many of these artists are going to showcase that doing nothing is killing thousands of people in America. In Felix Gonzalez Torres's Untitled or Lover Boy of 1990, we have a poignant example of what AIDS does to the body and what we do by our inaction, not taking political action and demanding that the authorities and the government do something about this crisis. So here we have the lover of Torres dying from AIDS in 1990. So this is a poignant reminder of what happens. You're supposed to go through this exhibition, and each time a viewer will take one of these sheets of blue paper. Thus, it slowly dwindles over the course of the exhibition, just as we see the slow dwindling and disappearance of someone affected with AIDS as their body and mind is going to wither and disappear in this way before our very eyes. A very poignant and touching way in which to bring the audience in as part of a participation here and completing the work. Our inaction in doing something causes the death of these individuals, is his argument. Now, as we have this allegory of life disappearing before us, it is very eloquent and postmodern because it is, of course, dematerialized. It cannot be commodified. That being, we are not going to be leaving something at the end of this exhibition that can be purchased, right? The act of taking it away and showing something diminish is the work of art. The idea behind it is. Now, turning finally to Kiki Smith, we have a feminist social activist who is the daughter of the minimalist sculptor Tony Smith. Her sister dies of AIDS, and it is when this happens that she begins creating sculptures that reinforce the physicality of the body and the loss of physical control that the dying experience. And once again, the fact that someone outside of the gay community, and of course a Caucasian woman, could die brings more light and more interest from lawmakers to this crisis. Now, in her work, we need to discuss the uncanny valley, that being this idea that as close as we get to human likeness, the approximation of what we look like, there is an area called the uncanny valley that is going to make us very uncomfortable and unsettled if something is almost lifelike, such as a humanoid, android, or robot, or once again a stuffed animal that looks realistic. This is going to make us feel uncomfortable because we cannot distinguish between the fiction of the art world and our own. And this is what Kiki Smith capitalizes on, and other artists like Dwayne. Here in her Untitled of 1990, we're going to have a female and male, figure, life-size, suspended, with their bodily fluids leaking out. Lesions form on the body, which obviously would happen if you have AIDS, because of course your body cannot fight bruises and heal itself as quickly. So here we have the flesh-colored beeswax, which appears almost alive, but almost lifeless. So you find that the figures are on the verge of death. Their bodily fluids now spilling out, the loss of control. We find milk spilling from the female's breasts, semen from the male's penis, and you find that these once sources of vitality and pleasure are now going to be uncontrolled. We find that in many of her works, she discusses the social abhorrence of losing control of one's bodily functions, and the fear of losing this close to death, and the fact that we are so concerned with that and not with actually caring for the dead and dying and doing something about the AIDS epidemic at the time. So here, just like with Damien Hirst and Serrano, these postmodern artists are going to force us to confront our bodily control and mortality, the fact that we will die, and the impossibility of understanding it. Thus, we do not take action to help others who may be suffering. So, this strategy for making art is obviously not a style, but instead is an approach, for there is nothing that these two works have in common, nor the photography of other artists discussed today. Instead, how we interpret them, how we interact with them, and how they communicate to us is what makes them postmodern, not a particular style like gestural abstraction. All right, so this is going to question the notion of originality and raises these issues, these social and cultural issues, forcing us to consider them. And this is still central to postmodernism and contemporary art today. All right, because the artist is now going to be a mirror to society, not, once again, the works being original and precious themselves. But the artist is really only important because they are able to allow us to see things in our society that we otherwise would. This concluding lecture for Survey 2 will cover postcolonialism and globalism, looking outside of these Western art movements that we have been so focused on in Europe and America. And instead, we'll look at how the West views the rest of the world and how global artists are going to in turn frame their work in order to expose these prejudices that we have. Now, at the time, we have postcolonialism is going to be driven by an idea called globalization. This is the unification of the world's economic order. Thus, we can have products that are created, shipped, and or manufactured in various countries, unifying the world's economic system. And so we are tied together in this global economy so that no one is going to be separate and or entirely autonomous. Now, it is argued that globalization is in fact westernization, or more specifically, Americanization, given the immense cultural influence that America has around the globe. Thinking about the products and companies that are known worldwide, such as McDonald's and Coca-Cola, such as these companies that are based in the US, but whose reach is extensive. Now, the unification of the world's economic order, or globalization, has its roots in the colonial empires of the 19th century, when Asia and Africa will be carved up by every major European power, and when the United States is founded, American powers, to where we find that the raw materials and resources necessary to drive the Industrial Revolution are actually going to be found in countries outside of these Western nations. We need coal and iron in order to turn this material into steel and the materials necessary to drive the modern world and modernization. This leads to the exploitation of these various countries that are going to still have colonial presence until the later 20th. Now, postcolonialism is going to be the discourse of the reactions to and effects of the cultural legacy of Western colonization. In other words, we are interested in what happens to these areas when these Western powers pull out. What are the residual effects? How do the people view themselves? What happened to their economy? How did we fundamentally change them when we colonized them? Now, the political movement of postcolonialism is much like feminism, and it will arise from decolonization after the Second World War. As part of the peace treaties, the Allied and Axis nations are going to agree to surrender their colonial aspirations and their territories slowly in Africa and Asia, finally pulling out completely by 1999. Now, we find that post-colonial discourse, and what we'll be looking at today, is intended to expose the preconceptions or the prejudices that we have in the West while looking at other cultures and peoples, and that it is nearly impossible for us to actually understand and look at these cultures without some type of Western prejudice. What is significant is that we recognize this prejudice and call attention to it. Now, the point of view is always going to be partial, that being, it is impossible for anyone to look at anything outside of their culture in an objective fashion. We always bring our framing of the world and our perspective, our values, our ethics, our morals with us when looking at other cultures. And we find that with post-colonialism especially, the viewpoint will always be partial and imbued with colonial interests, that being, what can we get or how can we exploit these other nations and these other cultures? So we will begin by looking at the Middle East and the Southeast Asian areas, specifically with Iran in the Middle East and then Pakistan. Now, in Iran, we have a famous photographer and videographer named Shirin the Shah, who criticizes Westernization, especially from the perspective that her own father abandoned the Iranian culture, the Muslim culture that she was born into, and instead enrolled Shirin in a Catholic school, where she claims their identity slowly dissolved as they were westernized, trying to come to grips with and instead adopt Western religion, sensibilities, dress, and ways of thinking. Now, she, in her work, is going to, with photography, a perfect follow-up to the feminist photographers we talked about in postmodernism. She's going to show how Iranians are stereotyped by the West in this post-colonial miscommunication between the colonizer and the colonized, in the fear that we all have of the other as a construct, In other words, in the West, we misunderstand what another culture is going to be intending and what they value because we fear them as something we are not. Therefore, if the Western cultures are primarily Christian, then the other culture must be something else the opposite of Christian. If they value monogamy, then they must value polygamy, and so on and so forth. In her series Rebellious Silence of 1994, we have a series of photographs of Muslim women with Arabic writing on various parts of their bodies while holding firearms or being juxtaposed against firearms. In the Women of Allah series, we have, overwritten with Farsi here, this type of Arabic, and then a weapon, the juxtapositioning of violence with the very language associated with these people. Now, it was following the Persian Gulf War, or Operation Desert Storm, from 1990 to 91, in which Americans and those in the West had their first widespread coverage and view of the Middle East. Now, when Iraq invades Kuwait, America declares war on Iraq, and we have the first war that is going to be seen live back home. We're publicizing the news coverage live from the front. So because Iraq was an ally of the Soviet Union, we carry on these tensions left over from war. Now here is another example from her Women of Allah series in which different parts of the body are going to associate the Western vision of this language with violence. And so we find she is subtly and or explicitly, we might say, showing how we even today in the West in the media are going to relate Muslims with violence and or so this is the stereotyping of Muslims and the Muslim culture, stating that they are all militants, all terrorists, and so therefore are all dangerous. Of course, she is stating that the billions of Muslims are in fact not all violent, that the religion preaches peace, and we overlook that given the images that we see in the media focusing. A similar miscommunication is going to happen in Pakistan, and the artist here, Rashid Areen, a London-based conceptual artist, will immigrate from that Middle Eastern country in 1964. Now, without any formalist training, he has an early minimalist phase and founds the post-colonial magazine Black Phoenix in 1989, covering third world topics. In his art, he also wants to showcase the misrepresentation and miscomprehension of Westerners when looking at his own culture in So as a Pakistani, he would make images like Green Painting 4 that very obviously included iconography and symbolism that a Pakistani would immediately understand. But because this is a Western audience that it's intended for, he's trying to show you how we view the world. Now what we have here is a series of 5 photos of the head of a bull being prepared for sacrifice with garlands framed by Urdu text, which is the Hindi-Urdu Muslim language of South Asia. Now, this is in preparation for the Muslim Feast of Sacrifice, the holiest festival on the Muslim calendar. It is going to fall on the pilgrimage to Mecca. Before making this pilgrimage, we have a huge feast in which bulls and cattle are sacrificed, and a big celebration in preparation for the Now the green in the background also is going to be related to the Pakistani flag, which is also green, which is a very important color for Islam, Areen notes, because he states it's associated with youthful rawness and the flexibility of a green twig. Hence we have the revitalization and the promise of renewal in the color green. But of course in the West we overlook the symbolism because we are unfamiliar with this practice in the Muslim world of this feast, and we're unfamiliar generally with the color of the Pakistani. Instead, Arene notes that we first see the cross, that being the bull, the Urdu text, and the green we all overlook initially, and instead are seeing the Christian symbolism. We are looking through the eyes of a Western Christian culture. So he's going to argue that Westerners are going to see the cross first. Thus we read Pakistani culture through this Christian lens, of course distorting and stereotyping this other as we do so. Now, the post-colonial interests of these artists demand an understanding of their cultures in their own visual languages. This is merely pointing out how we are distorting the interpretation of their cultures. They state instead we need to appreciate and learn more about them so that we avoid miscommunication and misinterpretations in the future. Another variety of architecture, which becomes common in this era, is going to be deconstructivist architecture, seen here and most famously at the Guggenheim Museum in Spain. At the Guggenheim Museum, we have a building that literally appears to deconstruct before our eyes. Now, this type of architecture is theory-based and deliberately disturbs the traditional architectural assumptions of what a building should do. Buildings should look stable. They should be rational. They should tell us what they do based on their form. Instead, we are now decentering the structure. We do not see the building the same way from all sides, and it appears to fall apart before our eyes. Now, the CAD program, as we just discussed, allowed Gehry to achieve this incredibly asymmetrical design and this organic sculptural structure, as it will be skinned with this luminescent metal. Specifically a steel skeleton covered by silvery titanium that will shimmer silver or gold depending upon the time of day and how the light hits it. So you find that if it's overcast, it might appear quite silver. Then when the light hits it, it will appear gold. It also looks different from different angles. So from the north, it looks like an organism, right? A living, breathing, oceanic-like crustacean. Whereas seen from the side, it looks like a massive ship, which is referencing the shipping industry that is going to support Bilbao in Spain, where this is located. Now, the Derridian deconstruction that inspired this structure is quite literally shown here in physical form as meaning, as we discussed with semiotics and deconstruction, is always intertextual and decentered. That means that everything we know in a sentence and the meaning construction systems with semiotics are always based on a clear system that is relevant when placed next to each other. Here, we're showing how meaning is going to spill out in the same way if we decenter it, as in architectural terms. Turning now to the developments in film and video, we have in 1965 the Sony Portapak, the first portable video recording camera being invented and made available to the general public. With it, this new medium, artists were able to provide instant feedback and store information on inexpensive cassettes that could be erased or re-recorded if need be. Obviously, it was very cumbersome early on, and you had to carry the power source and the film itself. Now, what we could do here is send what you record to more than one monitor, thus giving us a flexibility of the presentation of video art as it becomes. Now, early videos by artists are generally going to be performances, where artists with a few actors or props would walk back and forth in front of a still camera. It was not possible to edit this film yet, and it was a black and white image that was incompatible with the color TVs of the day. So this was most suited for small private screenings in galleries. Now, in 1974, this compatibility issue was resolved when they standardized the 3/4-inch tape, which worked better with TV equipment and allowed the ability to film something and then broadcast it. In the 1980s, we have a further improvement in video technology with lighter cameras, the ability to film in color, and then to edit in Enter Namjoon Pak, the Korean-born video art pioneer who's going to take TV sets and display different recordings in collage-like effects. Now, he makes site-specific works where we have multiple screens, each projecting something that is meant to communicate a larger, broader message. Here in his electronic superhighway, continental US of 1995, we have a series of states made up of different sets of monitors. Each one of these states is going to have a different program playing that had a computer-controlled monitor rapidly changing images relating to each state's culture and history. So the power of these mixed messages that are transmitted relate to how identity is constructed by the media. For New York, for instance, we have a closed-circuit feed of the viewer in front of this very installation, showing how our very identity is constructed by way of how the media tells us we should relate ourselves based on where we were from. So geographically, you obviously have different things playing like Little House on the Prairie, Oklahoma, and these various movies that were based in different states. Now, digital video is going to replace tapes and cathode ray TVs, right, by the 90s. And with improved ease of shooting and editing of digital video, we are blurring the line between video art and filmmaking. Now it is within the grasp of virtually any person and artist to purchase software technology to where they can edit the video that they shoot in a digital format and put it together with, again, a score and soundtrack, and then release it themselves on DVD. Now, the artist who pioneered this and illustrates how we can shoot a film and release it directly to the public on DVD or streaming is Matthew Barney. Matthew Barney was an installation artist who, through 1994 through 2002, created his famous Cremaster cycle, which is a story of arcane sexual mythology. Shot on digital video, we find that he no longer needed to rely on small art gallery openings to show the public. Instead, he released it directly to the public on DVD, and you can purchase it now anywhere you can order DVDs. Now, in this series, we have several movies that we invite you to watch the preview for that is located directly after this link. So please watch the movie and then return. It's very short and only a few minutes. Now, the idea behind Barney's Cremaster relates to the concept of gender mutability that questions gender roles and if we are, in fact, a binary of male and female. Because the Cremaster muscle, for which the series is named, is what actually controls the descent of the testes, shifting from ovaries to external genitalia in males. This determines sexual difference in human embryos. Thus, something as simple as a muscle determines our entire identity as a man or a woman. Now, the series is going to take place in the Chrysler Building, shot on the exterior, with Richard Serra, a famous installation sculpture artist and architect, as an architect. That is his character, that we must go through a series of levels in order to... So much like a video game, we're going through a series of levels as the symbolic content of the apprentice, that is us, is gagged, and we must, of course, perform a series of tasks in order to move up and eventually kill. Now, Barney and the leopard woman transform into Masons at the end of the series. Here we have modified Masonic costumes. So the mythology is very arcane and difficult to penetrate here. But the entire point is we're trying to transcend the dividing line between gender roles. That gender fluidity should be considered the norm, and we should not reinforce stereotypes of what men and women are like and can and cannot do. Now, following on how we view men and women, we have Vanessa Beecroft here, who is an Italian performance artist, known especially for her large-scale performances, usually with nude female models. Now, her works are going to force audience participation and generally make you feel very uncomfortable. So she calls it experiential art, and she titles her work VB for Vanessa Beecroft, and then the number of installations it is, such as the 35th installation. Now, she deals primarily with the perceptions of the female body, examining gender roles, relating to her own battles with anorexia. So especially she deals with the notion of voyeuristic looking and how women are objectified and made to feel as though they are not good enough, thin enough, tall enough, and or beautiful enough. In her work, VB35 of 1998, she will hire a series of models to pose in a gallery with a select few invited individuals to participate in this experiential performance piece. Now, this is by invitation only, in which 15 professional models will be hired, professionally and strategically thin, tall, and white. They were instructed to stand in loose groups facing forward. 10 wore high heels and designer bikinis, while 5 wore only high heels and were otherwise nude. Now, you find that the participants are going to be asked and instructed not to speak to the women, and they could not make eye contact or invade their space. So, of course, people are going to be unable to look at them in the eye, therefore unable to treat them like a... And so, this inverts the normal relationship between human beings. We are unable to view them in the eye, so you look up and down their bodies inadvertently. So you find that viewers felt very intimidated and discomforted while viewing this quiet and otherwise non-interactive presentation. It's as though they were caught in the act of looking illicitly, many of them noted. So like a voyeur, and showing how male gazes are going to objectify the female form, and how women, especially with body dysmorphic disorder, are going to feel they are looked at on a daily basis and scrutinized. Now, turning to Nadine Ospina, we have a Colombian artist who will combine American and European cartoon characters with Latin American and pre-Columbian traditions, such as presenting Mickey Mouse as a Mayan sculpture here. Now, his post-colonial parody is going to use Lego figures, most famously, blown up in massive photographs and sculptures to caricature stereotypes of Colombia, his native land. Now, when Americans hear Colombia, they generally are going to think of what they see in the news, and that is a nation of drug lords and violence, right? One that is at the crossroads from South America to North America, and how drugs make their way to the Americas. Right, so we find that the association is not positive. We are overlooking a rich cultural heritage, Ospina is going to argue, in a very light, playful, and comedic way. For in his series Columbia Land of 2004, we have one of these bandits with a weapon guarding a crop of drugs with the standard aviator sunglasses and an ammo belt crossing his chest. Now, it's meant to look like, obviously, a Lego figure, but posing in the form of a National Geographic, that being the magazine which would showcase ethnographic studies of peoples around the world. It's as though we find the native Colombian here in his native habitat, which all Colombians, then it's suggesting, are going to be drug lords who are engaged in the illicit drug trade. So this cultural colonization of Colombia by Western powers and American pop culture, Ospina is going to argue, is one that requires us to look harder and beyond our cultural stereotypes. That he is here showing in a light, playful fashion, relating this to Legoland, how Columbia Land is going to be understood by Americans. Now, turning to Yinka Shimabara, we have a British-Nigerian artist who is based in London, who is going to work primarily with these post-colonial interests and how identity is constructed throughout colonial history. Now, specifically, his works will often showcase Dutch wax fabric figures with headless mannequins, right, set up in exhibitions as they divide up Africa and/or are going to be engaged in orgies and otherwise tongue-in-cheek activities. Here in his How to Blow Up Two Heads at Once Ladies of 2006, we have two mannequins that are headless, pointing standard dueling pistols at each other's heads. Now, in his standard use, we have indeterminate skin color with masculine hands holding these 19th century flintlock pistols. So we find that the skin color is indeterminate in that it's not dark enough to be African, but not light enough to be Caucasian or European. Thus, of course, asking what identity or what box we would put these individuals in. Are they African or are they European? In addition to that, we find that the dress that they are wearing is a specifically Victorian one of the 19th century. So the cut is specifically European, reminding of the European nation. However, the material, the fabric that it's made of, is Dutch wax fabric, which is associated with West Africa today. Now, ironically, he's pointing out that this fabric does not come from Africa and has nothing to do with Africa. That the irony is that the fabric comes from Indonesia. It is imported by Dutch colonists in Africa, then exported and manufactured in England, and exported again to West Africa to be purchased. Therefore, like colonial identity, it is complicated. What is the fabric? It comes from all of these various worlds. So therefore, what does it mean to be African like Shimabara himself? He lives in London. Is he a Europeaner? Is he an African, right? Or is he both? Is identity more complex than that? What happens when we have these colonial powers that are going to control areas in Africa, marrying African women or bringing slaves to the New World? And then what does that mean for them and their tradition then? What is their identity? Finally, we give you Feng Mingbo and his Long March Restart of 2008. Also is going to be available in a video format directly after this presentation. Now, it relates to the Chinese Civil War, in which the Red Army, or those that are communists, are going to fight the nationalists. So in 1934, the Red Army was surrounded and only escaped by marching 8,000 miles, eventually triumphing in 1949, setting up Communist China as we know it today. So what Mengbo is going to show here in an interactive exhibition, playing it like a video game, is a scrolling image that moves across the surface in a wonderful retrospective look back to the 8-bit video games of the late 1980s and early 1990s. So the screen that it's being projected on is a massive 20-foot by 80-foot screen where an 8-bit game scrolls across. So the event, much like he's saying the Chinese view this event in modern mythology and in popular culture, is how we now look nostalgically back at our beloved video games of our youth from the past, looking back to something that is long. So please take a moment to watch the movie and to see how it scrolls through and uses popular video games and iconography from the early Mario Brothers series, Gataga. It's going to have a series from Metroid and these other early 8-bit games. So in the end, postcolonialism and globalism is going to address the complicated relationship of the West to the other, or those cultures outside of Europe and America. Now, it deals with issues of religion, economics, race, and sexuality, and especially is going to use the development of new media, like video games, like installation art, like digital art, to communicate these ideas and the complicated relationship that we have with the rest of the world and how we view them and represent them. So please look back on your notes and prepare for the final exam. The dates are posted in the syllabus and in the LMS.